It's the book on Perpetua's journey. This discussion also relates to that discussion. So a lot of this stuff overlaps. At any rate, we were talking about Pliny the Younger. We'll talk about persecution, and that will lead us into a discussion of Pliny and if we read in the Bible, you read about persecution, right? Jesus says these words, "Blessed are you when men shall revile and persecute you." Certainly Jesus was persecuted. Many of his followers, well, I guess I'd say most of his followers were persecuted. Many were put to death. Jesus was put to death. So what do we mean by persecution? There are different forms, different kinds of persecution. There is going from, I suppose, least extreme to most. Some just might be social ostracism. They don't want you around them because they don't like you because of your religion. Maybe they hate you, misunderstand you. Perhaps you'll be imprisoned, have the loss of property, physical abuse, torture, and even death. So I think this is probably a hard thing for most Christians to talk about. We don't like to talk about it. It's not a pleasant topic. And I think a lot of people would say, well, not having persecution is a good thing. But in fact, persecution makes the church stronger, not weaker. That would be my bold statement. It might make the numbers fewer. In other words, I think attendance at church services would go down if there was active persecution. But I think intensity of spirituality, if we can say it that way, would maybe go up. Well, at first the persecutions, as we read in the New Testament, are by the Jews. This is a controversial statement in some circles to say that the Jews actually persecuted Christians. But the book of Acts is pretty clear on that point. I had a friend who, as he was writing his doctoral dissertation, he was writing about Christians in the area of what today would be Jordan and how they fled Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple, and they moved into Jordan, the area of Jordan. And in his discussion, he said in his dissertation that Jews had persecuted Christians. That got him into a lot of trouble. And in fact, one of the professors told him he had to change it or she would not sign his doctoral dissertation. He didn't change it. She didn't sign it. He still got his degree. But I think she was hoping if one of the other two professors had sided with her, he would not have gotten his degree. Anyway, Stephen is martyred. Again, we might argue about the exact date, but by my reckoning, not just mine, but others, probably around AD 36. James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred by Herod Agrippa. We read about that in Acts chapter 12, probably around AD 44. James, the brother of Jesus, martyred. According to Josephus, this is not in the New Testament, but Josephus and Eusebius record that James, we know he was a leader in the church of Jerusalem, as mentioned in Acts 15, but he is martyred about AD 62. And so this Jewish versus Christian idea is there. The Apostle Paul, who was at first called Saul, persecuted Christians, right? We read about that in the book of Acts. He was on the road to Damascus where he was going to persecute Christians in Damascus, that Saul, had a vision of Christ and heard a voice, and he was blinded. And once he got to Damascus, he converted, he was baptized, scales fell off his eyes, and he became a passionate follower of Christ, an evangelist, a missionary, an apostle. Well, you can read about all that, and that, of course, I assume is not news to you. The persecution will shift. You know, part of the reason that the Romans did not persecute the Christians in the beginning, anybody know why? Why would it just be the Jews and not the Romans? Yes. Yes, exactly. The Romans believed that the Christians were another group of Jews. Well, you can see how they might make that mistake. Jesus was a Jew. All of his followers were Jews. And where we can really find out about this in the book of Acts is when Paul is at Corinth. And he has to stand. He was taken up on charges. He is brought before the proconsul called Gallio, who is the Roman proconsul. He's the proconsul of Achaia, which is the Roman region around Corinth. And what charges, who brought charges against Paul? Do you remember? Acts, this would be what, about Acts 20, 21? You could look it up. Acts, Paul in Corinth. Look up Gallio, Gallio. You will, I think it's 21, might be 20. Anybody find it?
I looked up Gallio.
Yeah, what'd you find?
The brother of Seneca?
Yes. But in the book of Acts, where is he mentioned?
18, 12 to 17.
18, not 19. Okay, 18, 12. He is brought on charges. Paul is brought on charges by the Jews. Acts 18. Okay. And it appears that there were times when the proconsul would hear such cases. On the Bema, it says, the B-E-M-A in Greek, the Bema or Bema was the judgment platform, judgment area. And so he would hear cases. I don't think he heard them every day. So they brought Paul up on these charges. Does anybody have the passage? What were the charges brought against Paul, and what was Gallio's rendering, his verdict? Or I guess he didn't have a verdict, but what did he say about the charges?
He was telling people to worship God in ways that broke Jewish law.
Okay, worship God in ways that broke Jewish law. This is what Paul was doing. Anything else? I think he said that did he say he's turning the world upside down? Something like that. He basically is disturbing the peace. Forgot the exact wording.
That's all that NIV says in this passage.
Okay, and then what was Gallio say?
If you were making a complaint about a serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you, but since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, settle the matter for yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. And he drove them on.
Okay, so Paul is brought before the Roman proconsul. By the way, this is also very important because we can date the time that Gallio is the proconsul of Achaia to within just a few months. Kind of like what the guy was talking about last night with dating of events, like the dating of the eruption of Vesuvius, the dating of this proconsul. Typically, people were proconsul for 1 year. You served 12 months as a proconsul. It was a stepping stone to other things. There was an inscription that was found at Delphi, a nearby Greek city, which mentions Gallio and his proconsulship, and it gives a date. So we can actually come up with the date within a few months of when this happened. But why that's important is the Romans at this point, at least Gallio, who was a Roman judge, Roman official, sees Christianity as Judaism. Did you see it there in what he said? He said, look, if this guy had actually done something prosecutable, is that a word? If he had done an offense, he said a misdemeanor or some other offense, then I would listen to your case. But he says, since this is a matter of your own religion, a dispute of your own religion, I'm not going to hear it. He dismisses it. He doesn't make a judgment. This is not for me. I am not going to mess with this. You Jews are always fighting, if I'm reading between the lines. I didn't actually say this. This is my paraphrase. You Jews are always fighting with each other, right? You got Sadducees and Pharisees and Zealots and so forth, Essenes. You guys are always fighting about one thing or another, the new moon, a certain way to interpret a law. He goes, that's not a matter for me. You Jews go and settle that yourself. So by saying that, he's saying that Paul was a Jew, that what Paul was teaching was a form of Judaism, and this is just another Jewish argument, and I will not hear it. Now, that's important, because that happens around 61, if I'm not mistaken. 61, the Jews still think of Christians as, the Romans still think of Christians as Jews. What happens in 64 in Rome? Rome burns, and the emperor is Nero. And who does Nero blame? He blames Christians, not Jews. So by AD 64, it has become clear to Romans that the Christians are separate from Jews. Now, why this is significant is that the Romans only had two kinds of religions, two categories of religions. Legal religions and illegal religions. Religio licita, religio illicita. If you were a legal religion, you were fine as far as Romans go. Go at it. And they had lots of religions in Rome. If you were a religio illicita, you were forbidden from worshiping your God. Okay? Judaism was a religio licita. That had happened back with Herod the Great. Herod the Great had a special relationship with the Romans. In fact, Herod the Great had spent a lot of time in Rome. He was friends with the Romans. He sent his children to live in Rome. His children were rubbing elbows with the emperor's children and other important people. And since he was very loyal, Herod talked the Romans into exempting the Jews from certain things that were expected of all Romans, like making sacrifices in the Roman temples to Jupiter and Juno and that sort of thing. He said, look, Jews can't do that. Jews only, he said, Jews are strange. They only believe in one God. See, it wasn't a problem for somebody who worshiped, let's say they worshiped Baal, for them to say, well, okay, I'll worship Jupiter, and I'm just going to see Jupiter as the Romans' Baal, right? And the Romans would say, okay, yeah, Baal's fine. Baal is just kind of like Jupiter. These guys call him Baal. We call him Jupiter. Fine. You guys worship Baal. We worship Jupiter. But you can worship Jupiter as Baal. But for the Jews, that wouldn't work. But Herod worked out a special deal. Therefore, Judaism was exempt from a lot of the things that other people had to do. As long as Christians were seen as Jews, they were exempt. They were placed in that special category of Judaism. They were considered to be religio licita, a legal religion. But once Christianity is separated from Judaism, and that happened sometime in the early 60s. I don't mean 1960s. I mean 62, 63, somewhere in there, because by 64, Nero is distinctly blaming Christians and saying, well, these Christians believe the world's going to be destroyed by fire, right? Which, of course, they do. God said he wouldn't destroy the earth by water again, but it's going to be destroyed by conflagration, burning, a fire. Okay. Once that is done, now Christians will be persecuted from the early 60s by the Romans. And the Jews, conflict with the Jews is not really mentioned much anymore, I suppose, because the Jews had their own problems and the Jews had made their case. The Jews are trying to say, look, these Christians are not Jews. To which I guess I'd have to agree. Therefore, they should not be under the umbrella of our protection. Once that case had been made, Christians are now open to be persecuted. So, here's what I was talking about. I guess I should have put this up earlier in the PowerPoint. Judaism was religio licita because of Herod the Great. Christianity seen as a branch of Judaism. Acts 18:12. There we go. Gallio. Had you look it up, but there I had it down, but So the Jews argue that Christianity is separate, and so around AD 61, Christianity will come to be seen as religio illicita. I can't point to a specific date, but certainly after the time of Gallio, before the burning of Rome. So, 61, 62, 63, that's it. All right. Now, how did the Romans view Christians? They viewed Christianity as a religion that, the Romans were very particular about class, about rank. Romans were not egalitarians, okay? So if you were of a certain Roman status, social status, you did not socialize with people of a lower status. Does that make sense? But the Christians were very egalitarian. right? Anyone could become a Christian. Everyone, once they became a Christian, was equal. Everyone was a brother, a sister, a slave. They associated with slaves and servants. And, you know, here's somebody who's a high social status, wealthy, inviting slaves to their house to have food and calling them their brothers. The Romans just were appalled by this kind of behavior. So Christianity got the reputation as being a low-class religion. Now, the other thing you got to remember is about a third of the population of Rome was slaves. Okay, that's a rough estimate, but pretty close. What does that mean? Been a lot of slaves. And the Romans were always worried about the slaves. They certainly were worried about the slaves since that guy over there on the right, Spartacus, in the 1st century BC, led a rebellion of slaves, if you remember, Kirk Douglas. Pretty good movie, by the way, if you haven't seen it.
So good.
I would recommend it to you. But anyway, and it's interesting to study the data we have on it, but you see Spartacus was a captured soldier who was then made into, as a slave, being a gladiator. And he and some other gladiators overpowered their guards at the gladiator training place near Mount Vesuvius. Brings us back to Mount Vesuvius again. But of course, about, well, more than 100 years before Mount Vesuvius erupts. And he leads a rebellion. And you know, I think what he really wanted to do is just take his gladiators and fight his way out and get back home. But once he got out there, he found all these slaves were, well, enthralled by what he was doing. And they left and they joined his ranks. And of course, most of them were not trained as soldiers. They didn't really know how to fight. But the Roman legions come after them. And they actually do pretty well against the Roman legions. And the Romans chase them around quite a while. Eventually, however, Spartacus kind of wanted to get them all out off the peninsula, and he worked out a deal for them to be sailed away. The guys who owned the boats took their money and said, "We got the boats ready for you." And then they contacted the Roman legion and told them where they were. And they got to keep the money. I'm pretty sure they didn't refund it. And then Spartacus was captured. They were crucified, it says, for miles along the Appian Way. There would be a crucifix on either side of the road with signs over it. You know, these were the rebels, these are the slaves. Because they wanted to make it a point to any other slave that saw this, that even Spartacus, your hero, is crucified. All these people who rebelled crucified. Why? Because the Romans depended upon slaves. Most of their slaves were not working in fields. We tend to think that slaves are agricultural workers. Not really the case in Rome. What did the slaves do for the Romans? How did they weren't really working in fields. What were the slaves doing? Yeah.
They kind of kept the cities running.
Okay, how?
They were like your scribes and a lot of your bureaucrats and plumbing and like.
And household.
Yeah. They worked in the homes.
So they did do a lot of, now some of them, like the Greek slaves, became tutors and scribes and teachers, but others were the people that did things in your house you don't really like to do, right? Like wash the clothes, prepare the meals, clean up, do the shopping, right? Now, think about this. If you've got slaves living in the house with you, which most wealthy Romans did, had several slaves in their house every day. If those slaves wanted to rebel, think of what they could do. Kill you while you're asleep. Kill your children. Poison you. All kinds of things they could do. So they did not want the slaves to get the idea that they should rebel. And they felt that Christianity was breaking down the social order. So upper class people looked down on them, that is Christians, and they saw them as an economic threat. This is going to wreck our economy. It's going to wreck our society. All right? Now, because of that, the Romans had misunderstanding about the Christians. So here are some of those things, and we get these from different writings. They believed that Christians were immoral, an immoral group, which is interesting considering the Romans are not exactly known for what we might consider pristine morals. But the Christians were accused of this. They were accused of it primarily because of the way that Christians would refer to each other as brothers and sisters. And they would get married. And they would greet one another with a holy kiss. And, you know, they would fraternize, or I guess fraternize. In other words, they were very friendly, and of course they're meeting in secret. They have to meet in secret because they're illegal. So you have these people meeting in secret, brothers and sisters, marrying each other, having children, kissing each other. They're immoral people. Interestingly, the Christians were also accused of being atheists. Why do you think a Christian would be accused of being an atheist by a Roman?
Anyone who denied the Roman gods atheists?
Yeah, they don't worship the Roman gods. I can hear them saying, have you ever seen a Christian go to any religious temple, festival? Have you ever seen them offer up one small offering to Jupiter or Juno or any other god? They never come to any of our celebrations, and these were big celebrations. You know, they just don't show up. Here's another charge: cannibalism. Why would Christians be charged with cannibalism? What's that? Communion. Yeah. We hear they get together in secret and they drink blood and they eat flesh, human flesh. And this is a religious act. And where are they getting that blood? And where are they getting that flesh? Rumors began to circulate that since they were immoral, that the Christians had babies between brothers and sisters, and that they would even sacrifice those babies and then drink their blood and eat their flesh. Well, can't trust them. Treason. Why would treason be of charge? They're not good Romans. Matter of fact, they're anti-Rome. Where do you think that would come from?
They wouldn't, with the whole conflation of the emperor and the gods, they would be against calling the emperor his proper titles that he gave himself.
They don't call the emperor by his proper titles. They don't go to the, these religious events, say at the Temple of Jupiter and stuff, these were also civic events. It'd be sort of like you're not willing to stand up for the national anthem. You're not willing to salute the flag or whatever, put your hand over your heart. You just remain seated Or perhaps you remain kneeling. In other words, you are not being patriotic, which means that you don't support our country. Also, Christians would not serve in the military. And I've heard people say, well, the reason Christians wouldn't serve in the military is that they were pacifists. I don't really believe that's the case. I believe the reason they didn't serve in the military is because you had to do religious oaths to be in certain government functions like the military, and the Christians did not want to be seen as worshiping Roman gods. Well, anyway, those are the main charges against them. Most of the Roman persecutions were regional, not empire-wide. But we certainly know that during the reign of Nero, the view of Christians altered. It altered from one that saw Christianity as being legal and part of Judaism to one that saw it as being separate and illegal. This is highlighted by the fire in Rome, and between the years of 64 and 68, we will see that between 64 and 68, the Christians are blamed and persecuted pretty severely during the time of Nero, especially around the area of Rome. This is recorded in the writings, the Roman writings of Suetonius and Tacitus. Tacitus writes a history of Rome. Suetonius is more like I guess we don't have it anymore. There used to be the National Enquirer. You remember these magazines that would be at the grocery store, checkout lane? I guess we don't have too many of them anymore. But they used to have like World Weekly News, National Enquirer, The Sun or something like, it's pretty scandalous sheets. Suetonius has sometimes been compared to that. He gives a lot of gossip, most people believe. But at any rate, both of them agree that Christians were persecuted. And in fact, they're placed into the arena. It says that animal skins were draped over them and that wild animals, hungry wild animals, were released, and they killed the Christians and ate their flesh. In another writing, Tacitus records that Nero had Christians brought to his garden party and that they dipped the Christians in pitch, which of course is kind of like tar, and put them up on poles and ignited them to be the lights for the night lights for the party, to light the party in the evening. We know thousands of Christians died. We don't know exactly how many. We do know that this is the time where both Peter and Paul die. They are executed by Nero. This again is not in the book of Acts. It's not in the New Testament. This is in Eusebius, the early church historian. Last spring I taught a course on early church history, and I had people read Eusebius as our best source. And Eusebius records that Paul is beheaded. he had to be beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. Roman law dictates that Roman citizens are executed by beheading because it's considered to be less cruel, more humane, because it's quick. Cut your head off and that's it. Peter was crucified, and according to Eusebius, requested that he not be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. So he was crucified upside down, and the shape of his crucifixion was an X. So this becomes known as St. Peter's cross, which is X-shaped rather than like a T. So,
in an ordinary crucifixion,
Yeah.
when you're right side up,
yeah,
your arms break, your shoulder blades go in, and you asphyxiate.
right,
And if you take too long, they smash your legs, so you can't keep holding yourself up.
right.
Would you just like take way longer to die if you were upside down like that?
I think so.
Okay.
I think they would have to tie probably nail your feet, but also tie them. So you'd have all the weight that way. And then they would probably did this on regular crucifixions as well. Not only nail, but tie.
Yeah, because they would tie the hand.
But you would be tied downward. I think you would end up dying primarily of blood loss rather than asphyxiation. And I think it would take longer.
Okay. I didn't know if there was any.
I would imagine somebody has done a medical study, but my guess is, yeah, it would take significantly longer to die upside down, because I think you could still breathe,
Right.
but you would be losing blood. And of course, having all the blood go towards your head, I don't know what all that would do to you. It might make it hard to breathe as well because of the weight on your diaphragm, perhaps.
But you'd probably die of something else.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I think. The next major persecution we know about comes under the Emperor Domitian. You might remember that Domitian is the youngest son of Vespasian. So Vespasian becomes emperor. After Nero, we have the year of the four emperors. You remember that? Where they actually have Nero and then three other emperors, all in the same year. They end up with Vespasian, who is a seasoned, unlike Nero, who was kind of many would consider him a spoiled brat, punk kind of guy. You end up with Vespasian, who is a seasoned Roman general. And so we start to see that kind of move, and it's actually a change of dynasty from the Julio-Claudians to the Flavians. Vespasian was a Flavian. His son Titus after him for just a couple of years, and then Titus dies, and then Domitian becomes emperor in 81. He too is kind of a spoiled brat kind of guy, I guess you'd say. And I think he sort of felt he had been neglected long enough, overshadowed by his famous father and his goody two-shoes brother, that he was always being compared to. Domitian, why aren't you more like Titus? Titus is a great soldier. Titus conquered the Jews. Titus is the guy that you should be like. Well, Domitian ends up being an emperor longer than his brother or his father combined. Now, another practice that we did kind of mention earlier in passing is the idea of emperor worship. It was not automatic. It wasn't, say, like the Egyptians. The Egyptians believed that every pharaoh was divine, right? As soon as they ascended to the throne as emperor, as pharaoh, they were the incarnation of the sun god. That's not what the Romans believed. In fact, you had to be nominated, you had to be voted on it by the Senate. And so it wasn't automatic. So, for example, Nero was never deified, right? Julius Caesar was deified, pushed through by Augustus when they saw a star in the sky. It might have been a comet. And they said, this must be the appearance. You know, because the Romans were also very superstitious, I think we would call it. Anyway, and so the Senate voted Julius Caesar as being divine. But it was after he was dead. And so that pattern began to follow. Augustus Caesar was voted divine after his death. I believe Tiberius was voted divine after his death. But it was not automatic. Vespasian was voted to be divine after his death. What Domitian thought, well, you know, if my father is divine, I'm his son, he was emperor, I'm emperor, of course I'm divine. Right? And why should I wait till I'm dead to get my divine adulation? You know, what good does that do me when I'm dead? Let's do it now. So that's what he started to do. He began to demand that he be called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And this starts around 95. Now, fortunately, I guess for the Christians, he's dead within a year. And I think the Christians would probably say that was not a coincidence. He's dead within a year because of providence, because of God's judgment. Some of them would say that, okay? They also later say that about Decius as well. Anyway, during this time of persecution, this is when John, the Apostle John, the one who stayed with Jesus when he was on the cross, if you remember, there was only one disciple that stayed with him. Remember that? And it was John. And there were two women, both named Mary. Remember that? You read the end of the Gospels, like Matthew, what would it be? Matthew 25, 26, somewhere in there, 27. And this is where Jesus, from the cross, looks at John and he says, behold your mother. Because Jesus' mother is there. And he looks at Mary and he says, behold your son. Well, this is King James, right? Anyway, he's basically charging John with taking care of his mother. Because Jesus, as the eldest son, it would have been his responsibility to take care of his mother in Jewish culture. Okay? That's the way it was. Jesus knew he wasn't going to be there, so he asked John to do it. John was the youngest, most people believe, the youngest of the disciples. So therefore lives the longest. By the way, John is also never martyred, but he is persecuted. So John moves to what would be Turkey today. He moves to the city of Ephesus. Mary goes with him. So if you adhere to the papist theology, as some in here perhaps are inclined. Then you would say that there's a lot of Mary stuff connected with Ephesus. And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church believes that Mary never died, that Mary ascended into heaven. Where did she ascend into heaven? From Ephesus. And you can go to a place near Ephesus, which is called the House of Mary. I've been there. They claim this is where Mary lived. And I think they believe somewhere in that area is where Mary ascended. And there's a spring, there's water there. People believe that's sacred water. They take bottles of it with them, so forth. You can drink from it. It's supposed to, I don't know, do something good for you. I drank a little. I didn't die, so that's good. Anyway, the connection between Mary and John is a long one. John, as he's approaching the end of his life, undoubtedly Mary is gone, either ascended or deceased. Because John's probably about 90 at this time. Okay? 80s, 85. And I think the Roman officials decide not to execute him, but rather exile him. And they send him to the island of Patmos. You can read about this in Revelation. The first chapter of Revelation, chapter 1. John says, I, John, your brother and companion in tribulation, was on the island of Patmos, and I, John, saw these things. Well, something like that. That's my paraphrase. You can look it up. And so it's from the island of Patmos, and I've been there, and I've been to the cave where they say John was when he received this, the grotto. John is exiled here on the island of Patmos. Now, John returns after the emperor dies, and probably dies shortly thereafter himself of old age. But we do know that there were some relatives of the emperor also banished. What does that tell us? Anybody know? What would that lead you to believe or assumption you might make?
You have Christian relatives?
He had there were relatives of the emperor who were Christian and who refused to offer sacrifice to him. And so he didn't have him executed, he had him banished like John. All right, he dies. The persecution lets up. Under the Emperor Nerva. Nerva looks a lot like a guy I went to high school with. Ross who?
From Friends. David Schwimmer, the actor. It's uncanny.
Well, I'll have to put them up side by side sometime on the pictures on the PowerPoint. Well, John returns to Ephesus. We have Trajan, Nerva, then that's when the persecution lets up. John returns. Trajan, this is Trajan, who looks like Ross. John dies of natural causes during the reign of Trajan. But this is the time of Pliny the Younger. You knew we would get there eventually. Pliny the Younger is the governor of Bithynia, which this is how we got started on this whole thing. Because last night we had the lecture about Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger. The nephew of Pliny the Elder was Pliny the Younger. And he's kind of the kind of guy, I don't know, when you read the letters, to me, he's sort of the guy that kind of kissing up to the emperor, like, oh, emperor, you know, I always try to do what you want me to do. And I wasn't sure what to do here, and this is what I did. I hope this was okay, because I thought this is what you wanted me to do. But if it isn't what you wanted me to do, then, oh, I will never do it again. But it's in there that he writes these letters that I told you about, a letter, and the emperor actually responds to him. So you can read Pliny's letter, you can read Trajan's response. And as I mentioned before, in the letter he says, someone came to me and he said that there were Christians, that they knew of Christians, and so I had them identify them. I arrested them. I brought them in, men and women. I reminded them that, of course, being a Christian was against the law, and if they didn't recant of it, they'd be put to death. And he said, I think he gave them 2 or 3 chances to change, to recant Christianity. And while he had them there, he also questioned them to try to see what they were doing. And that's when he said he tortured them. But he said all I could get them to tell me was that they met secretly on the first day of the week, and that they sang hymns and prayed, shared a meal, and that was about it. And so I put them to death because they wouldn't recant. I hope this was okay. So when Trajan writes back, what does he say? Oh, this is terrible, you shouldn't do this? No. He says, what you did was right. However, don't accept, sort of people squealing on Christians. This is my paraphrase. In other words, if somebody comes to you and say, hey, my neighbor's a Christian, don't, if you find out that they're Christians, then that's right. That's fine. But don't have people sort of ratting out their neighbors about saying, hey, we think these people are Christians. He said, don't do that. And so, evidently, he probably didn't. This is also the time that Ignatius is martyred in Rome. During the time of Hadrian, continues the policies of Trajan, which I'd say is sort of persecution, although not active persecution. It's like if they come to your attention, it is illegal, so take care of it. But it's not like you go door to door seeking them out. This is also the time when Justin, who is usually called Justin Martyr, his mother didn't name him Justin Martyr. He gets called Justin Martyr because he was martyred, and his name was Justin. Wrote his first apology of Christianity, where he tried to answer the charges made against Christians, to say that Christians are not cannibals, Christians are not immoral, and so forth. He went down through those charges we mentioned earlier. Antonius Pius. There were local persecutions during his reign, especially in Alexandria, prompted by the Jews, and also in Asia Minor and Smyrna, one of my favorite towns in Asia Minor. I just like saying Smyrna. Several die, including Polycarp. And if you're into your early church history and early fathers of the church, then you will recognize the name Polycarp, but I won't go into it here. We don't have much time left, so let me go to Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosopher. Most people know him from the movie Gladiator. That's the only reason they know him. Gladiator does not give a very accurate picture of the history at that time. Although one thing they did get accurate is that Marcus Aurelius did write out on the battlefield in his tent at night. He was writing Stoic philosophy. Now, they show him writing at a desk in his tent. They don't tell you what he's writing. But I like to think that they knew he was writing Stoic philosophy. He wrote a book called Meditations, which is his take on Stoic philosophy. There are some persecutions then, but basically what Marcus Aurelius begins to see, and he is one of the 5 good emperors, is that Rome is changing and that things are falling apart for Rome. Things are beginning to crumble on the fringes. The Pax Romana is ending, and he is the one, I don't know if he was the first one, but he certainly then comes to the conclusion, what has changed? What has changed about Rome? And he concluded Christianity is what had changed. There are now so many Christians. These Christians don't go to the temple. These Christians do not worship our gods. And therefore, our Rome is falling apart because of the Christians. And this becomes a view that is even picked up by the rise and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon, who blames Christianity for the fall of Rome.